Spectrovision Radio. Spectrovision Radio.
Hello and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey Hall, and I'm a folklore researcher. Hello everybody and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast. I'm here with Brother Richard. Brother Richard is a Capuchin Franciscan monk. For those of you who are not already familiar with Brother Richard's work, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be back with you again.
Yeah, me too. And I so enjoyed the last chat we had, and I got a lot of comments and emails afterwards from people saying this is such a breath of fresh air to be able to listen to Brother Richard, and saying that it really kind of restored their sense of going towards the church in these times, which is really important. I mean, I'm feeling that anyway. I feel a lot of people are actually returning to the Roman Catholic Church at the moment and the church in general, and so it was wonderful to exchange some discussion around these topics, and I will
Sure.
say also, of course, you are a poet too, and we are going to be hearing some of your work at the end, as we did last time. So yeah, how have things been for you? Because I'm seeing that you're in a different spot there.
Different space. Yeah. So we're mendicant friars, which means we travel. There's always a traveling aspect to it. So every 3 years we gather together for what's called chapter, which is the gathering of all of the friars in a particular geographical territory, and we elect our leadership, and we decide kind of what our priorities are for the coming 3 years. And this is a custom that goes right the way back to St. Francis in the 1200s. And so it's a kind of a constant renewal. And it's part of the Franciscan spirituality is that we are pilgrims, that every human being is a pilgrim. We are all on a sacred journey from birth to death. And as a result, it's a reminder to us not to kind of get locked into any particular place or even any particular job, because we can tend to define ourselves by our places, our jobs, our network of relationships in different places. And so for us, we see ourselves as wanderers. We're moving constantly. St. Francis said to the brothers they were to be pilgrims and strangers in this world, abiding not long in one place. That was the way he put it. And so I have moved. I'm now in a different community, still in Dublin, in Ireland, but a different community at the moment. And this is the office where the day job happens normally. So this is where I am currently. For those who might be interested, it's inner city Dublin, and it's a very old historic area. The parish that I'm in was founded originally for Vikings who had settled into Dublin after the various Celts and Viking struggles had kind of come to a close. There was an area in Dublin known as Dublin, the Black Pool, from which Dublin gets its name. And this was an area that was kind of set aside for Vikings. And the first parish for Vikings was set up just across the water, over the hill. And the second parish was ourselves here. So there has been a parish community here since the 1060s. So very, very old, but constantly renewing. It's now, a very urban inner city, a melting pot of nations and peoples. So whenever people begin to talk about things like migrants or migration or anything else, as we all know, it's so much in the news, we like to remind them that, the very parish you're in began as a parish for migrants in the 1060s.
Amazing.
So yeah, and there's still family lines in the area that would have Viking names that go right the way back to that time.
Goodness, what are those names? Do you know any examples of those names?
So funny names, things like Mumbly, for example, is a famous name in the area here. You'd also have kind of Flynn is a kind of a Celtic Viking name. It's a kind of an approximation. So a lot of the names that came out of the north are still present here, and some of those families would have been the area was a markets kind of fruit veg market area traditionally. So a lot of those people would be the kind of markets families. And it's interesting in our baptismal registers here. Now they only go back to around 1600 or so, but you can see that some of the families that are here now were here then. We're there then, I should say.
Yeah. How amazing. I know I've always wondered about, the Black Pool. What were they referring to with the Black Pool?
There's different arguments about it. So Dublin has two names in Gaelic, Dublin, which is the Black Pool, and then Ballyahoclia, which means the fording place of the river of the Wattles, which were kind of a stick bridge or a rush bridge. So they marked two distinct areas, and Ballyahoclia was very much the Celtic part of Dublin, and Dublin was very much the Viking part of Dublin, and they kind of grew into each other then and became the city of Dublin. And then when the Normans came in the 1100s, they sort of restructured Dublin and built a wall around it and made the kind of traditional walled city that you would see in most European places at that stage. So yeah, it was the Blackpool. I mean, they talk about just the dark waters of the Liffey and a kind of a darker area, and a place where the Vikings were able to moor their longships as well. The longships were unusual because they were quite shallow, so you could take them right up rivers. That was how they were able to raid. They could go right up the rivers, and as a result, they didn't need deep mooring. But the Blackpool seems to have been the place that kind of the first settlements as such happened there.
So it's talking about the depth. Really interesting. Thanks for that. Thanks for
You're welcome.
clearing that up. I'd often wondered about it. And as you were saying, you move every 3 years, and that's very much part of the tradition of the practices of the order and other orders too, obviously. But there's something about that kind of the transient nature of that, which allows you to kind of be at the edge of our society. I mean, it's very interesting that you say this is that all human beings are pilgrims, and I wonder how much we can kind of hold a summit with ourselves every 3 years and check in. That's a healthy thing to do. Do I love where I am? Do I love who I'm with? Do I love what I'm doing?
So there's a couple of practices that go with it that we have that might be, I mean, that anybody can do. One of the things that we do is what's called well, for us, it's the cell, the room, the celle, the cell. And celle just means small room. It doesn't mean a locked in place, but in the monastic understanding of it. So we would try and have a kind of an audit of what we have or what we're using, and to see, well, is there stuff here that over the last 3 years I haven't used or that hasn't been, of use to me? And then that would be placed back into common usage in terms of sharing with the brothers or, giving away to charity or whatever it might be. So to try and travel reasonably lightly. And then the other thing that it does is that because you're living with the change of the seasons, the change of the liturgical calendar as it moves through the seasons of things like Advent and Hallowtide and all of those kind of things. And then you're also shifting with geographically as well. So it allows one to kind of step more readily into the kind of liminal spaces, the spaces between as such, and even the fact that two periods for us that would be very important in terms of our own meditative practice would be, dawn and dusk. So we're invited in this particular spirituality of pilgrimage as such to be people who consciously choose the edge, and who find, by choosing the edge, find that you have a wider perspective as well. Because it's like anything else. When you stand back from something, you see a wider vision, a deeper vision. And often when we're up close and personal and very, very busy and lots of reactivity going on in our lives, it can be difficult to get a sense of perspective. So I mean, you don't have to be a monastic for this, but it's important. It's important, I think, that everybody has those moments, those spaces in their lives, you know, even weekly. I mean, the idea of a Sabbath, a Sunday, a day of rest, whatever it might be, was supposed to give a sense of perspective for the rest, because you were in some way recognizing that, all the work that I'm doing in the previous days is so that I can enjoy this space or these relationships or this hobby or this, you know, this particular thing that gives meaning. And I suppose so often, for most of us as human beings, we're so busy nowadays, especially, and everything demands instantaneous reaction, that the pauses have to be actually chosen and deliberately taken so as to make sure that we can be present to these things. And I often say to people, I mean, pursuant to the kind of work you're doing, people who say, well, like, you know, I don't feel anything, or I don't see anything, or I'm not aware of kind of spiritual presences or practices, whatever. Say, yeah, but make space for them. You know, you don't expect to keep your friends without making space for them. And the same is true for the spiritual practice, whether it's prayer to the divine or whether it's connecting with, you know, creation or whatever it might be. The important thing is to actually make space, to slow down and to move at its pace rather than the pace that this current time seems to kind of want to keep us at, this agitated space.
Thank you. That's very wise advice, and that's really important to both make time for reflection and as you say, for connecting with, you know, the divine and whatever may exist in those spaces, and that's what we're kind of talking about today too. It is coming up to Samhain, Halloween, as most people kind of celebrate this time as Halloween. First of all, I'd love to hear how your order, and perhaps how your own kind of personal practice, what your understanding of this time is, and what your practices might be, both of the order and whether there's anything personal that you kind of bring in for yourself too.
Sure. So I suppose Ireland is kind of Halloween central in many ways, in that a lot of what would be considered as kind of Halloween custom comes out of Ireland and comes out of the kind of Samhain celebration. And I suppose you have to distinguish a couple of layers there. There is the Celtic historical Samhain, you know, the feast of the year that was in fact, it was the New Year. It was the Celtic New Year. It was the beginning of the year, and it was also a typical harvest festival in that sense as well. It was a time to sort of celebrate and give thanks, and a time of fullness and a time of joy, but also kind of looking over the shoulder at the lean times that are coming. So, you know, that was present. Then you have Halloween and Hallowtide. So Hallowtide is the shortest of the seasons of the church's year, and it's often one that kind of people are sort of unaware of. I mean, I've met so many people, and so many Christians were unaware that Halloween itself, even the name itself, comes out of Christian practice. It's All Hallows Eve, you know, the feast of all saints. And so traditionally, like many traditional cultures, the church celebrates a feast day beginning with the vigil, the evening before. And so following our Jewish brothers and sisters, the idea was that when it got dark and it was bright enough to see the first star, that's when the day begins. Not dawn with sunrise, but it begins with the darkness of the previous evening. And so we've, like, I mean, everybody knows Christmas Eve, you know, you obviously, or New Year's Eve. So there's a very old idea of seeing in the feast through a kind of a vigiling experience of some description. And these would be more solemn or more celebratory, depending on the particular feast. So All Hallows Eve then marks this, and for us, it's the beginning of the time when we turn towards the ancestors particularly, and we begin to look at them in their various categories. So we start with the sainted ancestors, the All Hallows, those who have been hallowed, those who are holy. And this isn't just canonized saints, you know, the kind of saints you'd know about, like St. Anthony or St. Martin or whatever it might be. The idea here was to acknowledge all holy men and women of all times and places that have completed their journey and are now in the fullness of the presence of the divine. We had an old priest years ago who used to say, this is the feast of the common or garden saint, was the way he put it, the nice way of putting it. Because we've all known these people, good people, good neighbors, people who have sacrificed themselves for others, people who have brought joy or peace, people who have maybe lived very troublesome or difficult lives, but have overcome, the suffering or that, and have attained to some kind of transcendence or peace. And so All Hallows is a very special day when we remember them. And then that's a full solemn feast. We have the celebration of the Eucharist. Obviously, within our tradition, we would have the offices of the day are there. There's a special meal. It's almost like a little Christmas before Christmas, kind of. And then the following day is All Souls, and that's when we remember simply all the dead, all those who have ever lived, all those who've ever walked the human path, and we pray for them, because in the Christian understanding, particularly in the Catholic and Orthodox understanding within Christianity, it's not just that you die and you go to heaven, but that there is, for the vast majority of us, a period of transition and purgation that takes place between death and the fullness of the divine life and light. And this is what we would call purgatory, or in the Orthodox tradition, they would call it the toll houses, for example. The places where the soul, liberated from the body, now beholds the fullness of the divine light. They are absolutely saved. They can't be lost at this point anymore. But they look within themselves and see the elements of egoism or selfishness or self-centeredness that haven't been purified yet. And so this tension between wanting to be united with the divine, but at the same time feeling, I can't go there yet. I'm not ready there yet. There is a suffering element within this. But it is a joyous suffering, because it's the joy of having come home, but needing to be cleansed and needing to be healed and needing to be renewed. And so sometimes you'll often see purgatory described as fire, and that confuses people because they think like hell or suffering or that. But the idea is that love itself is fire. And we speak of it. I mean, how many romantic songs and romantic plays talk about burning love, And this is the idea that love in its purity purifies us of all the attachments that we would have had, which were unhealthy or egoic or deceitful or anything like that. And so the person in the purgative state is utterly enfolded in divine love, but experiences it at first as a kind of a fever, a crisis that is clearing all of the old the dross of our earthly deeds. And as that goes on, the purgative soul has a role itself, and that is to pray for the living. So the purgative soul is meant to do two things. Number one, to continue the journey of purgation and move forward, but also to remember its own descendants and to pray for them and to be with them and to look after them. And so in the Catholic sense, a full and proper ghost, as in a sentient human being who appears and can be conversed with and is the fullness of the soul's persona as it appears, that is taken to be a purgatorial spirit who is appearing to seek assistance through prayer or through help. So on the Feast of All Souls, we pray for them all, and we remember all of the ancestors, all of the lines going all the way back. And there are various customs. We light lamps for them, light candles for them. Every priest is entitled to say 3 masses that day for the dead, which is a big privilege because normally we only celebrate 1 mass per day. So we celebrate the Eucharist 3 times for the dead, morning, noon, and evening. And the offices of the dead, the psalms and chants for the dead are prayed. And that begins then the month of November. And the whole month of November is dedicated to praying for the dead, praying for the ancestors, praying that they would be at peace and also remembering them. So we would set up altars of the dead. So we would have photographs, pictures, etc. of the ancestors. Candles would be lit there, prayers would be said there. Maybe the family prayers at home would be said in front of the pictures of the grandparents or the ancestors. In Eastern Europe, there is beautiful celebrations of what they call kindling, which is lighting lamps in the graveyards. So if you go to Poland or Eastern Europe, often you'll find whole cemeteries alight with candles. People will bring and will kindle candles, at least for the first few nights, if not for the whole month, in front of the graves. And in Ireland, then, the kind of other customs that were associated with it, with Halloween especially, was Halloween was considered to be the night that one of 2 nights in the year when the ancestors could come and visit the home. The first was All Hallows Eve, and the second was Christmas Eve. And so the house had to be cleaned. To prepare for the company, as they would be called. If you had a hearth, a good fire was lit in the hearth, and bread and salt left in front of the hearth as a sign that the ancestors were welcome and that they still had a place around the table. And when the person would go to bed, instead of putting out the fire at night, the fire would be let burn low and would be let burn all night long. And this was so that the souls could warm themselves when they came to visit. Sometimes people would draw chairs up beside the hearth as a sort of a welcome. And because of that, any stranger that knocked on the door had to be welcomed or helped, because it was considered that this was the souls of the dead appearing. Even if it was a person you knew, it was that they had turned up on your doorstep, guided by the souls of the dead. Lamps would be lit in the windows, and this is where the famous pumpkin lamp comes from, because in Ireland and Scotland and Wales, they had no pumpkins, but they used turnips, and much harder to carve. And so they would be handed down, they would be kept. They weren't just disposed of year on, year out. And if you've ever seen some of these turnip lanterns, they are terrifying, much scarier than a lovely orange pumpkin. But the idea of this was to scare away anything that could come and would take the souls or would disturb the souls in their journey. And there's a whole legend about the first turnip lantern, a guy called Stingy Jack, who was a soul that had been punished for his meanness, again, not looking after the poor, and was forced to carry his head as a lantern wherever he went as he continued his journeys. Of course, when that went to America, then no turnips, and pumpkins are much easier to carve, so it became the pumpkin over there. And then there were 3 messengers that were sort of watched out for on Halloween. One was any bird or animal that turned up in the house unusually or knocking on the glass. And that was considered to be either the ancestors letting you know that they were there, or possibly an omen of death, that death would visit the family in the year coming, and to pray for whoever was going to die in that way. Second thing was the children who would come and knock on the door, and originally they were known as soul cakers, so they would dress up as goblins and monsters and all of that kind of stuff, not because they were scared of them, but because it was a response to the darkest time of the year. We're saying that as Christians, we don't fear the dark, we don't fear the monsters, we don't fear the demons, so we actually mock them. It was a kind of a mumming idea. And then the children would generally be given autumnal foods. Not anymore, I'm afraid. It's all sugar and sweets and all that kind of stuff. But you were, even when I was a child, it was the actual chant you had as you arrived at the house was, which was repeated over and over by the kids as they would walk down the drive, was "Any apples or nuts, miss? Any apples or nuts? Any apples or nuts, miss? Any apples or nuts?" And that's what you expected to get, was apples or nuts. It's only latterly it became sweets and sugar and all of that kind of stuff. And then you'd have a great night of either roasting the nuts or cracking them or trying to get into them. The last of the ideas then was that because the souls would visit the house, when you went to bed that night, if there was noise around the house during the night, you didn't get up. You left the house to the souls. And the next morning you would check to see what has been moved, what has been shifted, has anything moved. For example, if a photograph of someone was now down, it was considered that perhaps during the year they might suffer sickness or death. These were all little warnings or omens that were considered. Or if a clock had stopped at a particular time, traditional things like that. One of the things that some of the women did, my own grandmother did as well, was that they would fire gaze. So there was a looking into the fire on particular nights that were special nights, to see images or I suppose pareidolia in many ways, but a kind of a way of bringing the second sight forward. And some of them were very skilled at that. And the next day, then the bread and the salt. And I remember in poorer countries, because these were very precious commodities, bread and salt, but they couldn't be used for anything else. So anything that had been offered to the dead couldn't be consumed by the living. And this was also true for any offering that was ever made to the fairies as well. You couldn't then consume it afterwards. It had to be distributed. So the bread was broken up and would be sprinkled outside. And if the birds took it, the birds took it, but otherwise it went into the land. And the salt then was used to bless the house. It would be sprinkled in around the rooms, around the hearth, around the windows, as a way of kind of keeping negative influences at bay. So that was the kind of container that we find ourselves in.
You mentioned last time we spoke about the food, salt and water outside, and about how, that was an offering. And it's really interesting to hear as well that, that was then sort of used in terms of the protection too. And one thing that I've noticed about the tradition nowadays is that the children don't offer tricks, because in my day, sort of in early 80s, when we used to go trick-or-treating, I loved hearing the apples and nuts. I've never heard that before.
Yeah,
For
it was,
us,
yeah.
it's great. For us, it was just simply trick or treat, but we always had to have a trick.
Yeah.
And so if we're not... So the trick was, I guess, an acknowledgement, not that we knew this as kids, but, looking back now, it's an acknowledgement that these beings, these spirits that can be harmful, the ones that can be harmful, can play a trick on you.
Oh
You
yeah.
know,
Oh yeah.
and
The trickster was present. Yeah. Yeah.
right, exactly.
Mm.
And so, what do you think about the fact that we don't do the trick part? Did you do the trick part when you were a kid?
Yeah, we did. Oh gosh, we did. Absolutely. Yeah. Particularly if a house was somewhat mean.
Right.
So there were two kinds of trick. There was the kind of party piece, right? So kids would have a song ready, and there was the kind of idea that you were trading, in some way, that you were offering something to receive something, which is a very important kind of social contract. Even for the children to learn the idea that it's not just, I knock on the door and I get all the sweets and all the sugar. It's that I knock on the door and I'm expected to do something in order to receive. So there's a little bit of a give and you will receive thing going on there, which was good. So some of the kids, especially the little kids, the smaller kids, would have a nursery rhyme or a song to sing or whatever. And if you go back, particularly in Northern England, the trick or treating originally was what they came looking for were what were called soul cakes, and soul cakes were a small hard scone with fruits and berries, and again to do with what was available in autumn, marked with a sign of the cross, and the kids would chant looking for soul cakes, and the idea was that for every soul cake you were given, you would say a prayer then for the souls of the dead of that family. So again, it was a kind of a spiritual offering and receiving. Now the tricks and the things we did, you would knock on doors and run away. You would, sometimes people would have water pistols and things like that hidden beneath the costumes. And if somebody didn't give what you wanted, they'd suddenly be squirted or whatever. It did get somewhat times a little bit rowdy, where people would throw fireworks and bangers in through doors and things like that. So there was a lot of sealing up of letter boxes and stuff like that for the elderly that used to take place on that night. Stink bombs were a huge thing. Anything that smelled poor or badly, but again, it was all sort of taken in good fun. It never got to a point of harming or physical harm. It was never anything like that. But the idea was that in some way, if you were stingy, you were going to be punished for being stingy. There were situations where people would kind of walk muddy footprints up a wall or over a door or things like that. But those things, as you say, the kind of trickster stuff those kind of little things that were sort of marked you as a stingy person or a mean person or whatever amongst the kids have vanished, and it's become now, if stuff happens on Halloween, it's quite nasty. Some of the stuff that can happen, fires being set and stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
So the trickster element disappears, and that's I think one of the things that's really important is if it goes back to story. So like we would have known the fairy tales and the trickster stories from our own lore and legends. And so it would have been very easy to see how these applied to what we were now doing. Particularly to scare people, for example, or things like that. I mean, suddenly looking in a window or putting a mask up to a window or something, something like that would be those kind of things. And when the stories don't get told, the stories are the matrix that kind of hold social cohesion together. And so when we lose the common stories and the common legends, then what remains? Well, only the egoic element remains, which is like, give me all the sugar, and almost I have a right to this rather than delivering something to you to receive in return. So yeah, it was. It's unfortunate that it has vanished to some extent.
It reflects similarly in fairy tales. We take the kind of the cutesy, maybe beautiful elements, or without actually
The
looking
Disney,
at
the Disney version,
the Disneyfied. Yeah, we've kind of ended up with sort of Disneyfied acknowledgement of these times rather than what's really behind it. I mean, I guess the aspect of the punishing of the stinginess. We were going, as you were saying before, you're going towards the leaner times, the more difficult times, and people needed to chip in communities and actually be there for one another. If you have a big stash of whatever it is that you have harvested that year, then I guess it's an encouragement to share that with the community.
There's an album of music that Sting put together some years ago called of a Winter's Night, or A Winter's Night anyway, and it's a mixture of Christmas music but also folk music, the traditional folk music of Northern England, and he kind of beautifully melds it together in an extraordinary musician. But one of the songs he has in it is the Soul Cake song, and two or three of the lines are it's the children outside asking, singing and asking, and they ask the woman of the house or the man of the house, go down into the cellar and see what you can find. If the harvest has been gentle, we pray that you be kind. So it's that idea of if we've got it all stored up for ourselves, in some way we're not living socially what we're supposed to be living, and that there is an element of sharing really that's really important. So if we don't know those stories, those legends, which also tell us again and again that if we meet a creature, a being, a stranger, whatever it might be, that if we meet them with courtesy and meet them with generosity, then we are far more likely to receive something even better in return than not reaching out to help. So, I mean, some of the things, for example, growing up, we were always taught that a beggar on the street was to be at least acknowledged, not to be ignored, but at least to be acknowledged. And if they were playing music, you always gave them something. Because particularly if they were playing the pipes or the harp, it could be a fairy in disguise. Wow. And so that was when you always gave at least a coin, and if not, the tradition was in the days when men wore hats, they always tipped the hat to the beggar, and they always greeted them at least and wished them peace. Blessings on your hands would be one of the blessings on the music, or etc. would be given, because the idea was that they were giving you something. They were giving you music, in days when entertainment wasn't at the flick of a switch, the musician was a very important person. The piper was a very important person. And so passing them by, you always acknowledged it, at least with a kind of a nod, because they had given you something, and so something should be given in return.
I mean, that's so important. And, yet another kind of layer exemplifying what you were talking about before, that, we help those that have passed. Those that have passed help us.
Help us, yeah.
We help those in the community, and, God forbid any of us end up in that situation where we are the ones that, it's it's not too difficult thing to happen, especially in, you know, this day and age, and definitely back
Absolutely.
then.
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of reciprocity between ourselves, between the worlds, and a much
Mm.
more
Mm.
healthy way of being. You spoke last time about this kind of fear response that we have to these worlds, and I wanted to ask you about that again, because, you know, what you mentioned last time, I think I've written it down here, that you approach these worlds with an openness and an acceptance in the same way as you approach the unknown, you know, the say that the beggar on the street, the stranger at the door. If we, you know, move towards these worlds with this openness, and expecting, and, you know, and
Mm.
acceptance, you know, what happens differently? Because it, well, if we approach with a fear response, what happens differently? Because it, you know, it goes back to the way that we are socialized. I mean, in this day and age, we are socialized to kind of, you know, perhaps demonize things. You know, that's always what happens. We either kind of Disneyfy something or we demonize
Yeah,
something.
the two extremes. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And, you know, and it's particularly when it comes to powerful forces of any kind.
Mm.
And so, you know, what are we losing out by approaching these worlds with a fear response?
Well, I think we lose relationship primarily. That's the first thing we lose. So the basic rule of thumb, whether it's the beggar on the street, you know, the person who knocks on your door, or the other, whatever the however it turns up, is courtesy. You know, this is what all the old tales and stories told us. It was courtesy, and kindness. Those two things. That if you were fundamentally courteous and kind, then that afforded a protection. And so the idea being that I'm not there to impress myself and my way of being on others, but rather to respectfully meet the other, you know, with the reverence that comes from just acknowledging, well, if you exist, then it is the will of the divine that you exist. And so I'm always on holy ground when I'm connecting with anything that exists. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm naive. I recognize that the other may make choices in their life, whether that's the beggar at the table or, you know, the lady of the woods, may make choices that could affect me negatively. And so there is a level of protection and awareness that's necessary. But the old rules of courtesy, which unfortunately have been forgotten hugely in Western tradition. But what I see amongst the kind of the people who are interested in this whole world is they tend to have one of three approaches. The first is the kind of scientific, which is I'm going into this nearly as a biologist, you know, ready to label everything, and I want to know what the names are and how does it all work and what are the mechanisms. Okay, very scientific approach. Will get you so far. You'll get a certain amount of observational information from that. That's fine. But I always tell the person, reflect it back on you. If somebody came to you and said, I'm here to study you, as opposed to, you know, would you like to be my friend? They're two completely different levels of being and of encountering. And it doesn't mean that you won't get scientific knowledge from friendship, because, like, I can name my friends, I know their birthdays, I know their addresses, I know where they, so that's scientific knowledge, it's factual knowledge. But you don't know the person by knowing those facts. So in terms of personal interrelationship, I think that the scientific approach will only get us so far. And actually, I think a purely logical approach alone doesn't work in the other world at all, where very often we're told everything is the reverse of the way we see it here. The second thing, I suppose, is to approach it. A lot of people approach it with curiosity, but without lineage. So they walk in thinking just a general bumbling in, where I demand of it what I want will get me what I want.
Yeah.
And again, reverse it for yourself. If somebody just bumbled into your house and said, I've moved in now and I'm here and I'm going to, I'd like this food, or I'm going to take that from you, or I'm like, you'd kick them out very quickly. And what lineage does there is lineage bestows the courtesy, the rules, the And these aren't confining. What they're actually doing is saying, when you meet somebody at a business meeting, you shake their hand. When you meet your close friend, you give them a hug. When you meet your spouse, you give them a kiss. But there are levels of connection and relationship, and lineage, folklore, whatever way you want to call it, gives us that framework. So I think if we're moving in the bumbling kind of everything's beautiful, everything's wonderful, everything's going to be, it always reminds me of that story of the guy who pretty much forced his way onto Skinwalker Ranch because he had decided he needed to meditate there. And eventually they let him, because they just couldn't get rid of him. They thought this was the easiest way of getting rid of him. And he ran screaming from the place. Because, again, he was imposing his idea on the place. So for us, a huge amount of it is actually learning to just be still, to listen first before speaking, to arrive with respect, to arrive with gift, to arrive recognizing that you are moving into somebody else's home, somebody else's territory, somebody else's place, and to do so respectfully. I mean, a lot of those old folkloric things of how to behave in the woods, like never throwing water without announcing it, never urinating or defecating without apologizing, asking permission and apologizing afterwards, never engaging in kind of disrespectful behavior, never carving names and elements into wood or stone without at least an acknowledgement of feeling that in some way permission has been granted. When foraging, never taking more than you need, and always making sure that enough is left to replenish. To recognize, I mean, for example, one of the big things with Halloween with us is Halloween marked the moment where no more blackberries were picked after Halloween. And the reason for that is twofold. There's a folkloric reason and a kind of a practical reason. So folklorically, we would say that the puka spits on the blackberry at Halloween. And there's a curse on them from then on. And if you look closely at blackberries that have been too long on the branches, you'll see a kind of a grey mold or a blue mold over them. And that was known as the puka spit. And the berry is just rotting. But actually, if you take those berries too late, they have been laid in by insects by then. And so you stood a good chance of poisoning yourself, by taking them too late. So there was a practical reason and also a folkloric reason as well. And very often the two meld together. And it's not that anthropologists would say, the folkloric reason was invented so that, say, children would meet later. What we would say from a spiritual tradition is that actually they're one and the same. And that at an energetic level, you can say that the move towards the mold, the dying off, is as much a spiritual energy being withdrawn as it is a physical manifestation of just mold and bacteria. So getting back to what I was saying, I think the last kind of way is to recognize that you wouldn't go to live or to visit another culture without recognizing that I'm on their territory and that I need to be courteous towards them and respectful towards them, and they need to lead me, they need to show me, they need to tell me. And if that's the case, then I'm fairly safe, rather than wandering in and kind of stamping all over it, as so often the Western world has done.
Thank you. And I guess, that goes for sort of going into these places. You have a right to protect your home and where you live and behind your door. But you don't then go sort of wandering into the forest and clearing what is there, because that is not your space, so there's that aspect too, and being careful how you're speaking within these spaces.
As human beings, we can have a very utilitarian approach. This idea that everything is a tool for us to use, rather than a community of being. And so when we enter into the forest or whatever, I mean, praying in the forest or being, being in creation on spiritual retreat or whatever, that's all fine and perfect and wonderful, and we do it ourselves. But we would always do it in a kind of a gentle way that sort of says, thank you for allowing me to be in this beauty. Thank you for allowing me to be in this in this grace and understanding that every being present, whether visible or invisible, is held in a great experience, a great gaze of divine love. And so what I want to do when I move in there is to be in tune with that, rather than becoming the discordant note in the midst of the music there.
You gave us a lovely prayer last time, and I'll place that here again. It made me think about my own experience around this time of year, is that there are often, there's often an uptick in activity in our home. So, whereby sometimes I see kind of, it almost looks like the side of somebody walking past. You can't see a clear outline of them. You just get the sense of them walking past, as if sort of watching side of somebody's body walking past. Or you suddenly see what you think is the outline of somebody, maybe outside, or maybe even in your lounge, or, and then they're gone. Sometimes it can be an object itself that's been placed in an unusual place. It suddenly takes the form of something or someone. And so, yeah, what's your kind of recommendation on, these sorts of encounters that we have in our home at this time of year? And have you found this too, that this time of year marks an uptick? I mean, it can get really busy.
It does. It gets very busy at this time, and I suppose traditionally it was seen as one of the thin times, or the thinning space. It was the time in Irish fairy lore when the Seelie court and the unseelie court change. You have the trooping of the fairies as they shift and move. But also, I suppose, in the home, very often those kind of little indications would be seen as, well, the ancestors are around us. They're with us, And so normally, if we were getting a lot of that, we'd light a candle for them, say a prayer for them, ask them to say, well, look, if you're in need of something in particular, come and visit me in my dream. Let me know, because the dreams are very sacred, and are one of the places in which the souls are very active and very present. And it's kind of a safe way of doing it. One of the things that was often done in the Orthodox tradition, for example, if somebody really was worried about it, someone who had gone before us, well, they would fast for 3 days, fast on bread and water for 3 days, to allow a kind of a finer attunement, to come to a level of more, because food has its own energetic weight as well, and what we take, and I'm guilty of this as the rest of us, but what we take can take us down, can solidify us. So I think that's why so many of the spiritual traditions, our own monastic tradition included, would always include kind of times of fasting as a way of kind of spiritually attuning oneself a little further. Obviously, only if one is medically able for it, If you're not medically able to fast, there are other ways of fasting. You can fast from television, fast from the phone, fast from, it's about the purification of the attention faculty, not just, you're not doing it just to get the body beautiful kind of thing. That's a whole different kind of fasting. But I think when we catch these little glimpses out of the corner of the eye, they're just letting us know they're around. And unless it's particularly negative, I would just acknowledge it and accept it, that they're around. The different thing if it becomes negative or oppressive, that's a whole other world. But this, to me, what you're talking about is just the presences who have lived, who have been around, and who are just letting us know that, yeah, look, we're here. We're only ever a blink away. I think one of the reasons, and it's interesting you talk about the corner of the eye, because traditionally, the corner of the eye was the place where we would catch these movements, and I often wondered about that from a biological point of view. And it was a guy who was talking about biology of the eye some years ago. Now I will get this in the wrong order for definite, okay, because I'm remembering. But we know that the eye is made of rods and cones, right? The cells that are in different shapes, rods and cones. One or the other, I can't remember which, we have more of around the periphery of the eye. And it seems that they are more sensitive to these kind of whispering, passing visions. What's very interesting is that a child's eye has far more of these, and they are softer and wider. They take more light in, actually. And as we get older, the cells crystallize, harden, and narrow. And that happens from about the age of 8 or 9 on. So we become very good at focused vision, but not so good at the peripheral. Whereas the child tends to be much more aware of the peripheral. And women, by the way, have much better peripheral vision than men. And they think that that goes back to the whole hunter-gatherer division. That if the woman was with, minding children and older people and needing to take in the whole forest to see what was available, then wider vision was possible. Whereas the men, in terms of hunting, had sight that was more focused and more movement aware. These are only theories, but it's just fascinating to parallel them with our experience, and I think that's one of the things.
That's absolutely fascinating. In these healing workshops I go to, we practice seeing people's auras, and so something anybody can do, but the point is that instead of focusing, you just let your eyes kind of relax and just let them almost kind of go out of focus, and then you see the shapes, lights around people. I often see sparks around people, especially if they're talking about something that really means a lot to them or that is their truth.
The softened gaze is a really important thing, and in fact it's taught as a contemplative practice, even in terms of how we meet people, how we see people, etc. Because we have that very focused, staring kind of gaze. It's uncomfortable. I mean, the human being doesn't like being stared at. It can be almost predatory, in fact. But the softened gaze is a great the gaze that takes everything in, that sits back and takes everything in. There's a wonderful poet and contemplative teacher now gone to God, but a guy called Robert Lax, 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 who was a great friend of the mystic Thomas Merton. And Lax was a layman, a poet, but he has some beautiful, beautiful writing on what he would call the poetic way of seeing, which is essentially the same way. He talks about, start with a tree and focus on one leaf. And really, really bring your eyes to rest on the one leaf, but then move back and allow the leaf to vanish into the tree and see the whole tree and just be with the whole tree as it moves, to see it as one living being rather than millions of little leaves, but one living being. And he says this is the way we actually begin to encounter the divine in our life as well. It's when we move back and have that perspective that we begin to see, oh, this is how God is present. This is how love is present. This is how even the narrative, the actual narrative of our story, assumes greater meaning when we stand back from it than when we're up close to it.
One other thing that we spoke about last time, you were talking about the apparitions. I'm going to read the entire title here by Augustin Calmet.
Oh, yes, I have it here beside me. Yeah.
Do you? Oh, great.
Yeah.
The Dissertations on the Apparitions of Angels, Demons, and Ghosts.
He was a Benedictine monk who was charged with basically, I suppose he was kind of a folklorist of his time. He wouldn't have known that kind of word, but he was charged with going around to investigate the opinions. Particularly, there had been a wave of reported vampires in Moravia and Greece. And the church wanted to investigate to see whether there was any truth in this matter at all. And so they picked him as a kind of a very wise man to go and to investigate. So obviously he had to travel from where he was all the way to Greece. And in his travels along the way, he continually asked people, what about, anything strange going on here? The same kind of stuff that we've all asked. And he slowly collected and collated this and created 2 works that are now put together into the treatise that you just mentioned there, which originally had the wonderful title of Some Strange Opinions Amongst the Greeks, but thankfully they've changed it to a more appropriate title now. And he was a very logical man, very, very down to earth. So, for example, questions of witchcraft and things like that, he very clearly distinguished between the kind of the cunning art, the healers and the curers and those kind of things, and said, look, there's nothing weird or wrong going on with any of that. This is essentially herbalism mixed with prayer, mixed with knowledge that's been handed down, but it's human, and there was nothing he totally rejected the idea that this was sorcery in the diabolical sense of things like that. He's one of the first to make it very clear that charges of witchcraft were often used to get widows off land. And he was very, very strong on the fact that the church should defend people who were being treated like this. And that literally, he says, unless they can sort of produce, demonic proof there and then in a court, everything should be dismissed automatically. He was one of the first to say that the idea that some of the substances, herbs, etc., that people took could be responsible for some of the visions that they were having. Yeah. And he was also very strong on the fact that, yes, spirits do exist. Yes, ghosts do exist. There's a huge amount in it on, visitations from the dead and people who have returned from the dead, the kind of near-death experiences kind of stuff that we would call nowadays. Speaks a little bit about UFOs in the sense of lights and light phenomena. Has some very interesting stuff to say about the kind of house spirits, elves, fairies, what they may be, where they come from, and then finishes with his big investigation on vampirism, which at the end he lands on these things do not exist. That essentially the vampire, in the sense of a human revenant who returns, he says, is one of two things. It is a spiritual manifestation by the diabolical side of things to frighten people, or it's mistaking physical symptoms in corpses of the dead, and that people didn't know about. So he was, there's a mini series to be made about this guy, a kind of a medieval X-Files. Definitely, he was an extraordinary individual, and I would encourage any of your listeners. Thankfully, there's a very good English translation available now of this stuff, and it was fascinating. I suppose one of the, in terms of what's of relevance to specifically to your podcast, he naturally had the question, well, if people, I'm going through everywhere from Germany to Finland to Lapland. He took a very circuitous route. I mean, he made use of his permission to travel, and they're all talking about gnomes and elves and familiar spirits and house spirits and all of this. But what are these things? And he very quickly separates it out into, well, if these things are negative and are causing problems and are hurting people, then he would see them as coming from the diabolical end of things, particularly if they were sowing fear or confusion. That was his thing. But he said we do come across a middle category, okay, the famous middle kingdom of the Irish idea. And he said, if all of these people from all of these times and places are telling us that these things exist, then we would be foolish to think that they don't exist. And the scriptures tell us that there are wonders beyond wonders, wonders not made for the mind of man, etc. And so there's no problem fitting them in scripturally, or is fitting them in from a religious point of view. And so one of the suggestions he makes is that actually the household, what were known as the household gods of the classical era, the sort of layers and penates and those kind of ideas, he suggests that they may actually have become over time the sort of the tomten, the nisti, the brownie, the household spirit. Now, I think it's a good theory in terms of from where he's coming from and from the knowledge that he had, which was how do we bring this into for him modern times. Of course, he wouldn't have been aware of a lot of the kind of Celtic lore and legend. But one of the things we have to be careful of when we say things like Celtic lore and legend is there's actually very, very little recorded historical Celtic lore. There is a huge amount of Victorian projection onto the Celts. There's a massive amount of that. So an awful lot of what we think of as Celts and Vikings and how they lived and what they did is actually Victoriana projected back through right up to sort of the early 1900s. And the kind of revival, the Celtic Dawn revival, the kind of very mystical Celtic Dawn revival, which, is good in and of itself. But in terms of its historicity and the actual sources that are there, they're very, very few and far between. What I think about Calmet, though, is interesting, is that he for him, the way he looks at it is he looks at the practices associated with these things. And he says, well, the practices associated with the household gods as such, small g, household gods of the classical times, are very similar to the practices associated with these gnomes, brownies, Missy, etc. And so this is where he makes the parallel.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of a little corner of the house that was undisturbed, where these were to live. The idea that they defended the house and the people from thievery, particularly, that they were very hard to see, but that only the children and animals seemed to be very well able to see them, and some of the elderly people could see them quite clearly.
Mm.
That they had that they could be appealed to for sort of divination, or not so much telling the future as sort of asking, say, for example, is the fella that we've allowed to stay in the barn, is he okay or not? That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The idea of that food and the food offerings were made to them, particularly what they called the living foods, so milk, cheese, butter, honey, things that had life in them, which again seems to be ubiquitous across the spirit world. And then the other thing that he had, though, was how they became mischievous and how they could, it was very, very easy to insult or upset them. And if they were insulted or upset, then you seem to get this tirade of kind of poltergeist-like problems. So people suddenly discovering that all the dishes in the house had been broken, or all the clothes had been, that had been freshly laundered, were now smeared with dirt or whatever. And that it took a lot to kind of placate them. So that was his theory. And it's an interesting theory in terms of at least showing that over the thousands of years from classical civilization right the way through to the kind of modern, for him, late medieval, early Renaissance period, the country people had a familiarity with these things and were living with them pretty much the same way.
In your opinion, do you think the Roman house spirits were the same as?
My answer is I don't know. I don't know. I think one of the things that we often get wrong is we impose our vision of religion today, say a modern vision of religion, on what the classical world had as religion. And so, there was kind of almost a two-level religion there. There was the religion of the senators and the philosophers, etc., who would use the figures of the deities to kind of indicate particular things. They were the personification of forces, the personification of things. And then there was the ordinary everyday person who literally, had to manage with the land and the day-to-day work, and they would have been much more tuned towards the kind of house spirit end of things. And a lot of it was about placating the gods so that misfortune wouldn't come on yourself. Whereas the religious end of things that we have is the idea that, and by the way, even in the classical tradition, they would also have had this idea of a numinous creator beyond even the gods. That the gods themselves had been created. There was a creator that was so far distant that they didn't really, the unmoved mover of Plato, for example, or the demiurge of the kind of Neoplatonic stuff. This idea that there was something beyond even the gods themselves, and even the fact that the stories, the myths, talk about the twilight of the gods and the ending of the gods, and gods could die eventually, and all of this, they were seen as being far beyond what a human being was, but at the same time, not beyond the venality and the egoism and the vices of a human being. So if it comes down to is A the same as B, a bit like Calmet, my response to that is I don't know. Or the most I can say is that A behaves a lot like B.
He also talks about levitation quite a lot.
Levitation, there's kind of four versions of levitation, if you like. There's natural levitation, which can happen occasionally in moments of great kind of ecstatic kind of life, and children, actually, a lot of children will talk about floating off the bed or flying or floating down the,
Yeah, I did
that
this.
kind of. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the problem is that they get told, no, you didn't, or they can't, or whatever. And that little click, that switch just switches, and we can't seem to find it again, you know. But I know many kids, and I've got many kids who talked about. I remember one kid who could go out of body completely, and he would just, you know, you'd call him to yourself in a classroom or whatever, and he'd say, "Oh yeah, I was just at home for a few minutes," you know. So like that sort of stuff is very is very natural, and it's and a lot of the traditions, you know, would speak of the movement of the kind of whatever you want to call it, life energy, chi, bioelectric energy, whatever, can generate this from time to time. The second form is levitation out of the body, but somebody thinks they're in the body. Mm-hmm. So it can be so real to be out of the body that people can actually really feel that they're almost still physically present. And it's only when either they see that their own body, or they get a moment of suddenly realizing that oh, I can't touch anything or whatever. That's when they'll get the shock and bang, straight back into the body, and it feels like a descent or a fall. Third kind is to be lifted by a spirit. So either positive or negative, but spirits can lift us. This was one of the things Calmet talks about, for example, is discerning what kinds of spirit are involved with that. And then the final one is what we would call ecstatic divine levitation, which is the person is so filled with the light of the Holy Spirit or the movement of the divine that they, without knowing, often without consciously knowing, they are levitated, but to extreme degrees. So people like Joseph of Cupertino, for example, or these kind of people who, and within that, some of them have. It's completely ecstatic in that it's beyond their will. They don't know what's happening. And some do know and are able to switch it off or on. So yeah, there's different ways of doing this along the way.
You know, reading about the levitation, hearing about the levitation, really interesting, because not only for myself, but there are a lot of people that I speak to that are either in, you know, in my group, my community, or who are guests on the show, who have experienced this. As children. We all, and I say we all did this. We probably all didn't, you know, but the people that have had the experiences, it's not like I'm saying every single child does this, but a lot of children I know, particularly people that report these experiences later on, remember very, very clearly doing this as children, and how they could will themselves to do this in some way. But yeah, I mean that's a whole other thing. There are so many other questions I wanted to ask you, but we'll have to have another chat. But there are some questions from my Patreon community.
Yeah.
So Katerina was asking, she said, I'd like to know how Brother Richard closes himself off to spirits and sets boundaries. I've discovered I'm very bad at this.
Okay, so obviously there is, within our tradition, there are particular prayers and rituals that we offer daily, which are to shield and protect us. Particularly devotion to one's guardian angel, to the Archangel Michael, especially, and the other angels, but particularly Archangel Michael, and especially Our Lady. So as a friar, daily we place ourselves beneath the cloak, we call it beneath the mantle of Our Lady, and ask her to be the one who kind of accompanies us and who protects us. And being a good mum, which is what she is, she's a good mother. She looks after us, and you know, you don't have to be Catholic to ask her. If you ask her, she'll be there, because she's mother of us all. The second, I suppose, in the more ritualistic end of things, we would use things like holy water, blessed salt, sacred oil that's anointed, the relics of the saints, for example. If I was traveling to places maybe to do difficult problems or cleanses, I would always have relics of the saints with me. They come with me, and often in a hidden way. It can be a way of recognizing if you get a sudden manifestation because you've just brought a relic in. It can let you know that, you know, other things know what's there. In terms of ancient prayers, one of the most beautiful ones is what's known as the Lorica, or or the armor of St. Patrick. Most people would know the breastplate piece, which is the Christ be beside me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ be above me, etc. But it's a much longer chanted form, and this was a prayer given to St. Patrick, it said, given by the angels to protect him during one of his most difficult times, when he also had an encounter with encounter is the wrong word, also had an experience of kind of shape-shifting, actually, because he had to get to a place, a sacred place, and he wasn't able to get there because there were soldiers to stop him. And the soldiers said that they saw a stag pass by when St. Patrick passed by instead. So it's a much longer story. I'll go into it some other time. But as a result, the other name for this for it is the cry of the deer. And it's a beautiful one because it also invokes the elements as well to be present. So yeah, different ways. The other, in terms of just basic practical ways, be grounded in the body, be grounded in prayer, be grounded in we talked about the ancestors, for example, asking our holy ancestors who have gone before us to be with us and to protect us, because they can see and they're around us in a special way. So I think the more grounded we are, the better. And the more we let go of the egoic self and just simply get involved in compassionate service to others, that grounds us more than anything else as well.
Thank you. I have to say, as you said, cry of the deer, I saw with one of these flashes that we were talking about before, when someone's talking about something that is true or meaningful, I saw a little flash even at the side of my laptop. Now, as I'm looking at you, I can see you on screen, but in the air to the left of my laptop is the flash, as you said that, so that brings up a lot of
Yeah.
questions for me, but again, that will be for another time. But you spoke last time about people inadvertently making agreements with spirits. I'd like to know how we break or change those agreements. What are some ways to show respect to them without giving up our power or agency to them? Now, some of what you've just, talked about in this discussion will apply to that. But is there anything else that you feel needs to be
So in
noted there?
terms of particularly where things have been promised, okay, think about it in a human way. If you need to get out of a contract, what do? You go to a higher authority, okay, and so any kind of spiritual contract you have made has no standing within the next level up, within the next higher authority. And so if it's a case of you politely say, I can't do this anymore, or I'm not doing this, or I'm letting it go, or whatever, and you seem to be getting negative backlash, then I would take it to a higher authority and basically start bringing in the angels then at that stage. And not to make war, but to start off by saying, look, I'm not achieving this. So I turn to my guardian angel and I say, look, will you please go and speak on my behalf? And this can be done, by the way, even in terms of human meetings. A lot of the saints would say, if they have a difficult human meeting coming up, they would say, look, I'm going to get it wrong. I know I'm going to say the wrong thing or whatever. So guardian angel, you go and speak to their guardian angel beforehand and let it be peaceful. And it's incredible what that can achieve. The same can be done with the ancestors. The same can be done if it's really becoming negative and very difficult, and you need to break it. Then I would immediately bring in, the Divine Mother. I would bring in Our Lady in that moment, and just simply say, look, I give this, whatever that agreement, that compact was, I give that entirely into your hands now. And I'm asking you to sort it out for me. And one of the great titles of Our Lady, it's one of the most beautiful ones, but one of her titles is the Untier of Knots. And to hand it to her under that title of the Untier of Knots, and to allow her to make peace, to bring peace there again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that reminder. What knowledge, ideas, or conversations about spirituality or the spirit world do you think are missing in the general discourse, which are in fact important?
Gosh, I think all of them, all of it's missing. That's the problem. I think we're very lucky and blessed in certain corners and communities that this is the conversation, but very often it doesn't pervade. And when I look back at, say, my grandmother's generation, ordinary life and spiritual life were one and the same. You know, they were lived together. It wasn't a reserved corner of the room or of the house. It was living. It was human living. And I think we only live fully as human beings when body, mind, heart, and soul are all involved together. You know, the totality of our human experience. So I think the most important thing at the moment is recognizing that the spiritual quest, however you want to see it, whether it's in my lineage or anybody else's lineage, is about what? It's about arriving at the most compassionate, truest sense of what it is to be a human being. And so if my quest or journey is taking me into, you know, fame and fortune, or egoic selfish desire, or if it's all about pleasing me, as the famous maxim goes, you know, if the God you believe in hates the people you hate, then that's probably the fact that you're worshiping yourself and not God. So we try and keep ourselves as expansive as possible and as reverential and respectful as possible, as I said before, and pursue truth at all costs, but allowing that to overflow always into compassion. Truth is hard and cold by itself, and so it always has to be clothed in compassion to be of any use to us, of any value to us. So I think if those conversations were present more in the kind of spiritual world and in the general world, we'd be doing a lot better.
We really, really need to take that on board, and thank you very much. Yeah, you talked about perhaps ending with a very personal and wonderful poem of yours that feels very right for these
Sure.
times too.
So this is called All Hallows Eve, and it was a poem I wrote in tribute to my grandmother, who was one of these sharp, wise women. So we'll go with this. This was the evening she swept out the hearth. I helped, sort of. Once clean and perfect to her discerning eye, milky white now, though the light behind them was sharp and never dimmed, she would set bread, brown soda always, and salt before the banked flames. For the visitors, she would say, whenever I asked, as I did annually. Her breath whistling half-heard prayers, she would go then from room to room, straightening cushions, flicking tables with tea cloths to clear the last vestiges of dust from surfaces so well polished with age and use they gleamed. The house should be clean when they call, she would say. We would have tea then, waiting. Sometimes she had cake or a ginger snap, dunked first to soften it for dentures. I had cake too. Then she would sit in her stiff-backed chair in front of the fire, waiting. I would sit beside her, sometimes in the big green armchair, slowly sinking into the old feather-filled cushions, so big my feet swung. More often, I perched on the stool beside her chair, where I could watch the TV with her. But not this evening. This was always different. No RTE news, no Crossroads, no Coronation Street's plaintive trumpet, just sitting together in the quiet, waiting. Tonight, there would be just the fire and the bread and the salt left out, blessed and prayed over and freely given for the guests whenever they would come. And then she would talk about them, all of them, her mother and father, her aunts and uncles, and tales of Dublin so long ago it seemed they should be with once upon a time. Her own grandmother got special mention. They called her a sharp woman, wise, brought in for the birth and the death, you know. She had the understanding, she would say, and then say no more for a while. Sometimes she would speak in a different voice reserved only for him, of my grandfather Martin, her husband, gone an age ago to me, but still so present to her heart. Then her eyes, looking across the flames at faces I could not see, would bring to mind all those others too, who had already gone. And she would go quiet. Where have they gone? I would ask. Home, she would simply say. But tonight, they would visit. Once, just once, it made me nervous to think of it. She laughed then. Nervous of the dead? Don't be silly. Aren't they family? Aren't they friends? Don't they pray for us? Don't we pray for them? You can fear the living, she would say, a sharp smile playing about her wrinkled eyes, but never the dead. A Christian never fears the dead. Sure, don't we have the Blessed Virgin and all the saints around us too? Then she would take my hand and we would just sit, waiting. She praying, I wondering, feeling the wrinkled warmth of her loose-skinned hand. Safe. Then she would suddenly say it was time for me to go home. So I would go then across the green, home to parties and noise and black bag wearing, apple bobbing, door knocking, sparkler waving, help the Halloween party roaring fun. Sometimes I would think of her, sitting in front of the fire, waiting. But mostly I didn't. Until the morning, All Saints' Day, off to Mass, a day off school as well. Then in the afternoon, I would drop over to find the telly on, the chair turned now to face it once again, the bread gone, salt scattered to bless the house and garden. It's Richard, Gran, I'd shout, and I would hug her and tell her all about it, the parties and the sweets and the things we then called wine apples because we didn't know what a pomegranate was, and the lady who always gave rotten Brazil nuts you couldn't crack. Last Christmas leftovers, we were absolutely certain. And she would laugh and make the tea, and we would sit again side by side and wait for the two Ronnies, her favourite. And then I would remember and ask, but only during the ads, of course, did they come? Oh yes, she would say, they always come. What do you do when they come? Now, what does anyone do when visitors come? She replied with a slow smile. You chat, I'd say. Exactly, she glittered. Now be a good boy and turn up the telly. And I was, so I would. A quarter of a century has passed since she went home. But still, this night always, I welcome the visitors too. Friars and family both now. Sitting before the candle flame, breathing the blessed breath of memory and prayer, waiting. Just as she, my first elder, taught me, waiting. She now, a visitor too.
Really, really moved by that. Thank you. That absolutely, absolutely wonderful. And it's the stillness that brings is quite something, actually. And hopefully each of us this year can hold both, you know, the quiet time, the waiting time for our loved ones, and the joyous side of things for, you know, the children in our lives, or the child within us too, you know, going along to these celebrations. So thank you so much for sharing that. It's absolutely wonderful. I feel very, very, I feel like something's been satiated in me.
Wonderful.
Really great.
I don't know if you noticed, but halfway through, the lights have all just gone here.
Oh,
the electricity stopped. So they're with us in many ways.
They really are. I did. I felt a lot in that. And I'm going to go and sit quietly. And I mean, I do a sprinkling of these kinds of traditions each year.
Sure.
But I'm going to consciously practice, you know, what your grandmother practiced this year. I'm going to talk to my little one about it, and I think we're going to take, you know, more of this on board and actually explore this ourselves. So
wonderful.
Thank you for the inspiration. As always, just brilliant to speak to you, Brother Richard.
Well, thank you, and thanks for all that you're doing and all that the people you're connecting, and yeah, love to all the people out there, and I wish them all a very happy and blessed Samhain and Halloween and All Saints and All Souls, and I hope it's a time of great richness for them all.
Thanks so much for listening and watching. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider joining us on Patreon for dozens more episodes of unreleased bonus content, monthly online events, and a private chat. We are a warm, supportive community, and it really helps to support the project. Find us on patreon.com/The Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast.